We all know the feeling, that sharp sting in the chest when someone betrays our trust, the heavy silence after a cruel word, the burning ache of rejection, humiliation, or abandonment. Most of us carry wounds like these, hidden beneath the surface, sometimes for years. And when they resurface, the natural reaction is anger, resentment, the desperate thought, "Why did they do this to me?" But here's a thought that may sound almost impossible. What if the very people who hurt us are the ones we should be grateful for? Grateful to the ones who broke our hearts, to the ones who humiliated us, to the ones who taught us pain. Because in the teachings of the Buddha, those who hurt us are not enemies. They are mirrors, they are catalysts, they are teachers. Think about it. A friend who always agrees with you, who never challenges you, may comfort you, but they rarely force you to grow. It's the ones who push you into discomfort, who shake the very ground you stand on, that reveal who you truly are. There is an old Zen saying, "The obstacle is the path." And when life places someone in front of us who wounds us deeply, we are standing at a threshold. A hidden door has been opened, though at first it looks like nothing but pain. Consider this. If no one ever insulted you, how would you know the depth of your patience? If no one ever betrayed you, how would you understand the fragility of attachment? If no one ever broke your trust, how would you learn the value of letting go? It is in the fire of adversity that the soul is tested, and it is in those tests that the seeds of wisdom begin to grow. But let's be honest. Gratitude for those who hurt us doesn't come naturally. Our instinct is to recoil, to protect ourselves, to strike back. We want to erase the pain, not bow to it. And yet, if we look closely, we may discover that the wound itself is not the enemy. The wound is an invitation. When someone wounds us, what they truly reveal is the part of ourselves we've been ignoring, the anger we suppress, the pride we carry, the fears we bury. They hold up a mirror, and in that mirror, we see the shadows of our own mind. Without them, those shadows would remain invisible. In that sense, those who hurt us are the ones who show us where the work needs to be done. They point us toward the exact places in our hearts that are still unhealed. And isn't that the role of a teacher? The Buddha himself faced insult, ridicule, even hatred. And yet his response was never vengeance. Instead, he met hostility with silence, with compassion, with understanding. He showed us that the real battlefield is not outside but within. And those who hurt us are not simply attackers. They are the ones holding the key to that battlefield, forcing us to confront the war raging in our own minds. So the question is not, why did they hurt me? The real question is, what can I learn from this? Every wound carries a lesson. Every betrayal, every insult, every heartbreak contains a hidden seed of wisdom, but only if we are willing to look. Only if we are willing to see the wound not as the end, but as the door. Because pain, as unbearable as it feels, has a strange power. It cracks us open. It dismantles the illusion that life should always be safe, predictable, and kind. And in that breaking, we begin to glimpse truths that comfort alone could never show us. The wound is the door, and those who open it are the unexpected teachers we never asked for, but perhaps the ones we need most. When someone hurts us, our instinct is to point outward. They are the problem. They are the reason I'm suffering. But if we pause for just a moment and turn the gaze inward, something remarkable begins to appear. The pain we feel is not only about what they did, it is also about what lives within us. Think of pain as a mirror. When anger rises in your chest after an insult, the mirror is reflecting not the insult itself, but the pride you carry. When betrayal shatters your heart, the mirror reveals how tightly you were clinging to expectations. When criticism makes you defensive, the mirror is showing you the fragile walls of your ego. In this way, those who hurt us are like unexpected mirrors, unforgiving, unfiltered, brutally honest. They show us the parts of ourselves that are usually hidden. Imagine a person walking through life with a crack in their armor, but they don't know it. Then one day, someone touches that exact spot and suddenly the pain flares. The natural response is to blame the person who touched it, but the deeper truth is this: the crack was already there. The touch only revealed it. This is what Buddhism calls upadana, our clinging, our attachments. The insult or betrayal is just the spark. The real fuel is already inside us. And so, the mirror of pain does not lie. It forces us to confront what we have been avoiding. Without the people who hurt us, we might continue believing that we are perfectly patient, endlessly compassionate, unshakably strong. But when life throws a harsh word our way, when someone humiliates us, suddenly the truth is revealed. We see our anger, we see our fear, we see our longing for control. It is not comfortable. Mirrors rarely are. But isn't that what growth requires? To see clearly, even when the reflection unsettles us. Think of it like polishing a gemstone. At first, the stone looks rough, dull, ordinary. But when rubbed against something hard, when placed under pressure, the hidden brilliance begins to shine. Our hearts are the same. Without friction, they remain untested. With challenge, their true radiance begins to emerge. Of course, it doesn't mean we should go looking for people to wound us. Life will bring them anyway. The practice is in what we do with the reflection once it appears. Do we break the mirror in anger? Or do we look carefully, acknowledging the truths we'd rather avoid? In Buddhist practice, this is where mindfulness comes alive. When someone hurts us, instead of reacting blindly, we can breathe. We can observe the storm rising within. This is anger, this is fear, this is pride. And in that observation, something shifts. We begin to see that the enemy is not outside, it is the unexamined parts of ourselves. And here lies the hidden gift. Every painful interaction becomes a teacher. Every insult becomes a lesson. Every betrayal becomes a path. Not because the other person is righteous or good, but because they held up a mirror we could not hold ourselves. It is not easy to look, but those who dare to face the mirror discover freedom. Freedom from being enslaved by anger. Freedom from being ruled by pride. Freedom from the endless cycle of blaming others for the wounds that lie within. So the next time someone hurts you, pause. Instead of asking, "Why did they do this to me?" Try asking, "What is this pain showing me about myself?" Because the truth is, every wound is a reflection. And only by looking into that reflection can we begin the journey of transformation. If pain is a mirror that reveals the hidden self, then we must ask, why do these particular mirrors appear in our lives at all? Why this person at this moment with this wound? The answer in the Buddhist tradition lies in karma, the vast, intricate web of causes and conditions that shape every moment of our existence. Karma is often misunderstood as some sort of punishment, as if the universe were keeping score. But it is far more subtle, far more profound. Karma simply means action, and action always bears fruit. A seed is planted, and in time, the seed will sprout. The people who cross our paths, even those who hurt us, are not accidents. They are part of the unfolding of countless causes, threads woven long before we were even aware of them. Imagine throwing a pebble into a still pond. Ripples move outward, touching the farthest edges. Our actions, words, even thoughts are like those pebbles. The ripples may take years or lifetimes to return, but return they will. And sometimes they return in the form of another person, standing before us, pressing on our wounds. When someone insults you, when someone betrays you, it is easy to see them as the enemy. But Buddhism invites us to look deeper. What karmic threads brought this moment into being? What old seeds are sprouting now? In this way, even our so-called enemies are collaborators in our spiritual path. They are the conditions through which our past ripens into the present. Without them, the hidden seeds within us could not come to the surface. The Buddha once explained it with great clarity. When a person strikes you with a stick, you do not blame the stick. You look at the hand that holds it, and you look further at the mind that commands the hand. In the same way, when someone hurts us, they are but a stick in the vast hand of karma. They are an instrument of the unfolding web of causes. Think about it. Perhaps in another time, another life, the roles were reversed. Perhaps you caused harm, and now life has arranged a lesson, not as punishment, but as balance, as opportunity. Or perhaps the person who wounds you now has appeared to help you see what you could not see otherwise. This does not mean we must tolerate abuse or allow harm to continue unchecked. Karma is not an excuse for passivity, but it is an invitation to shift perspective. Instead of drowning in resentment, we can ask, what is the deeper lesson here? Why has this soul crossed mine in this way? When we see life through the lens of karma, the world softens. Enemies lose their sharp edges. They become participants in the grand drama of awakening. They are not random villains. They are threads in the same fabric, woven together with us in ways too deep to fully understand. And so, gratitude begins to bloom, not gratitude for the cruelty itself, but for the chance to see, for the chance to grow, for the chance to awaken through the very pain we wish to avoid. Picture a spider's web glistening in the morning dew. Every strand is connected. Pull on one thread and the whole web trembles. That is our life. That is karma. And those who hurt us. They are simply strands pulled taut, calling us to notice how deeply everything is connected. So when pain arrives in the form of another person, remember, this moment is not random. It is the fruit of seeds long planted, the echo of ripples long set in motion. And within that recognition lies a gentle wisdom. Even those who wound us are part of the path, part of the web, part of the mysterious unfolding of awakening. A wound by itself is just pain. It can remain raw, festering, a scar we carry for years. But there is another possibility, one that turns suffering into something luminous. The wound can become wisdom. Think of fire. Left untamed, it burns, it destroys. But placed in a lamp, it illuminates the night. Pain is the same. Unexamined, it consumes us. Transformed, it becomes light, guiding us toward compassion, patience, and insight. Consider the story of a young woman betrayed by someone she loved deeply. For months, she drowned in anger. She replayed the betrayal in her mind like a broken record, and each time the wound cut deeper. She hated the one who hurt her, but even more, she hated herself for trusting too much. Then slowly, through meditation and reflection, she began to see something different. The betrayal revealed her own attachments, her craving for certainty, her desire to control the outcome of love. The wound exposed her fear of being alone, and instead of rejecting those feelings, she began to sit with them. She breathed with them, she learned from them. Years later, she said, that betrayal was my greatest teacher. It broke me, yes, but it also broke open the cage I had built around my heart. This is the alchemy of the Dharma, turning poison into medicine. It is not about erasing the wound, but about using it as fuel for awakening. When someone humiliates you, you can respond with rage, or you can use that moment to cultivate patience. When someone rejects you, you can collapse in despair, or you can use that rejection to discover your own worth beyond others' approval. When someone deceives you, you can become bitter, or you can learn the precious value of honesty, both with yourself and with others. Each wound contains within it a hidden lesson, but only if we choose to look for it. This is what the Buddha meant when he taught that suffering is not an obstacle, it is the path itself. Without dukkha, without dissatisfaction, there would be no reason to seek liberation. Without the sting of pain, there would be no longing for freedom. The wound awakens the search, and the wisdom is born when we allow the wound to teach us. A Zen master once said, "The hardest people in your life are your most important teachers. A kind friend may give you comfort, but a harsh enemy gives you growth." When we look at our pain this way, the story changes. We stop asking, "Why me?" and begin asking, "What is this showing me?" The shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Transformation does not mean we pretend the pain doesn't hurt. It does. The betrayal stings. The insult burns. The rejection aches. But wisdom grows not by denying the pain, but by holding it gently with awareness and asking, "What can this moment teach me about myself, about impermanence, about compassion?" And slowly the wound stops being just a wound. It becomes a doorway. It becomes a guide. It becomes a teacher dressed in the disguise of suffering. So when life hurts, and it will, remember this: you are standing at the edge of transformation. The wound can imprison you, or it can set you free. The choice is not in what happened, but in what you choose to see. Because hidden within every wound is the seed of wisdom, waiting for you to let it grow. If pain can be transformed into wisdom, then those who cause the pain become something more than just obstacles. They become teachers, hidden mentors disguised as enemies. It may sound strange. How could the one who insulted you, who betrayed you, who hurt you be called a teacher? But consider this. What do friends usually give us? Comfort, support, reassurance. Beautiful gifts, yes. But rarely do they stretch us beyond our limits. Rarely do they force us to confront our deepest shadows. And yet, when someone opposes us, when they challenge our patience, when they stir up our anger, they are presenting us with the very lessons we most need to learn. Think of a sword being forged. The blade is not shaped by gentle caresses, but by fire, hammer, and relentless pressure. Without that, it would remain dull and weak. In the same way, our character is sharpened not by those who agree with us, but by those who test us. The Buddha himself acknowledged this. He once said that without those who oppose us, the practice of patience would never be possible. How could you develop compassion if no one ever gave you a reason to feel anger? How could you learn forgiveness if no one ever wronged you? Enemies in this light are not just obstacles. They are opportunities. They are like personal trainers for the heart, pushing us to build muscles we would never develop in comfort. Imagine someone insulting you in public. The sting is immediate, but in that sting lies a choice. You can lash out, feeding the cycle of hostility, or you can breathe and see the insult as a lesson in humility, a practice in self-control, or imagine being betrayed by someone you trusted. The wound cuts deep, but again, there is a choice. You can close your heart forever, or you can use the betrayal as a teacher in impermanence, a chance to see how fragile trust and expectation truly are. In both cases, the so-called enemy is giving you something your friends never could, a chance to rise above yourself. There is an old parable from the Buddhist tradition. A monk was repeatedly insulted by a villager. Every day the man would hurl abuse, testing the monk's patience. One day another monk asked, "Why do you endure this? Why not respond?" The monk smiled and said, "This man is my greatest benefactor. He gives me the chance to practice patience every day. Without him, how would I know the strength of my compassion?" It is not that enemies are noble or righteous. It is not that their actions are justified. The gift is not in the cruelty itself. The gift is in what their cruelty awakens within us. They force us to see the edges of our endurance, the depth of our compassion, the limits of our ego. And in seeing those limits, we have the chance to expand them. The hidden teacher is often the one we least expect. The one who makes our blood boil, the one who unsettles us, the one who exposes our weaknesses. And yet, if we are willing, we can bow inwardly and say, "Thank you for showing me where my practice is still incomplete." So the next time someone opposes you, pause before labeling them as an enemy. Look closer. Beneath the disguise, they may be the mentor you didn't know you needed, the one who teaches through challenge, the one who sharpens your spirit, the one who makes your compassion real. Because sometimes the harshest enemy is the greatest teacher. If we wish to understand how to face those who hurt us with grace, there is no greater example than the Buddha himself. His life was not free from insult, rejection, or hostility. Quite the opposite. Throughout his 45 years of teaching, he encountered anger, jealousy, and even violence. Yet never once did he allow hatred to take root in his heart. One story tells of a man who despised the Buddha. Day after day, this man hurled insults at him, mocking his words, questioning his integrity, attacking his character. The disciples burned with anger, ready to defend their master, but the Buddha simply smiled. When asked why he endured such abuse in silence, the Buddha replied with a simple analogy. If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong? The disciples answered, "It belongs to the one who offered it." The Buddha nodded. In the same way, if someone offers me their anger, their insult, their hatred, and I do not accept it, it remains with them. Why should I burden myself with what is not mine? Another tale speaks of Devadatta, the Buddha's own cousin, who turned against him. Out of envy, Devadatta tried to divide the Sangha, even plotted to take the Buddha's life. He sent assassins, rolled boulders down a hill, and unleashed an enraged elephant upon him. Yet, the Buddha's response was never revenge. When the elephant charged, the Buddha stood calm, radiating compassion so vast that the beast knelt before him. These stories are not legends meant to elevate the Buddha beyond human reach. They are reminders that the highest practice is not found in quiet caves or perfect conditions. It is tested in the presence of those who oppose us. The Buddha showed us that real strength is not in striking back, but in remaining unshaken. Real victory is not in defeating the enemy, but in refusing to let their hatred grow inside us. Compassion in this sense is not weakness. It is the ultimate power. To meet hostility with kindness, to meet insult with silence, to meet hatred with love, this is not passive surrender. It is the courage to break the cycle of suffering. Imagine what happens when anger meets anger. The fire only grows. But when anger meets compassion, the fire has nothing to consume. It dies out, leaving space for healing. This is the boundless compassion of the Buddha, not limited by who is kind to us, not conditional upon who deserves it, but radiating freely, even toward those who wound us most deeply. A disciple once asked the Buddha, "Master, should we love those who harm us?" The Buddha replied, "Do we hate the sick because they are sick? No, we offer them care." In the same way, those who harm us act from ignorance, from blindness, from suffering they cannot see. To hate them is to hate the sick. To offer them compassion is to heal both them and ourselves. The Buddha's life was proof. Enemies can be faced without hatred, wounds can be met with love, and even betrayal can be transformed into compassion. His example invites us to rise above our instincts and discover a strength greater than vengeance, the strength of an unshakable heart. The Buddha's compassion may sound extraordinary, almost unreachable, but it was not a miracle. It was the fruit of training, a training of the mind so steady, so deliberate, that compassion became his natural response. If we wish to follow even a small part of his path, we too must train the mind. Think of the mind like a wild horse. Left untamed, it runs wherever it pleases, toward anger, toward fear, toward resentment. But with patient training, that same wild horse can become a trusted companion, strong and reliable. The mind is no different. Through practice, what once reacted with rage can learn to respond with wisdom. So how do we begin? First, we must learn to observe. When pain arises, whether from harsh words, betrayal, or misunderstanding, pause before reacting. Feel the heat in your chest, the tightening in your jaw, the rush of thoughts demanding revenge. Simply notice them, as if watching clouds pass across the sky. This is mindfulness, seeing without immediately acting. Next comes reflection. Instead of asking, "Why did they do this to me?" ask, "What is happening inside me right now?" By turning the mirror inward, pain becomes a teacher. We begin to see our patterns, our triggers, our attachments. And in this seeing, a little space opens between the wound and our reaction. In that space lies freedom. The Buddha often taught the practice of loving-kindness meditation, metta. In silence, you send well wishes first to yourself, then to loved ones, then to strangers, and finally to those who hurt you. You repeat phrases like, "May you be free from suffering, may you find peace." At first, it may feel impossible, even fake, but slowly, like water carving stone, the heart softens. Hatred loses its grip. There is also the practice of patience, not a passive waiting, but an active training of endurance. When insult strikes, instead of reacting instantly, breathe. When provocation comes, pause. Patience builds resilience, like muscles strengthened by lifting weight. Each time we resist the impulse to lash out, our inner strength grows. And then forgiveness. Not a forced act, not pretending the wound doesn't hurt, but a conscious release of the poison within. Forgiveness is not about excusing harm. It's about freeing ourselves from carrying it. When we forgive, we stop drinking the venom that was never ours to hold. A monk once asked his teacher, "Master, how do I deal with those who constantly provoke me?" The teacher replied, "Imagine they are a torch of fire. If you grab it, you burn. If you push it, you still burn. But if you simply watch, it burns itself out. Do not grab the flame, do not fight it, let it die on its own." Practical mind training is not about suppressing anger or pretending we are saints. It is about seeing clearly, pausing wisely, and responding with intention rather than instinct. Over time, the heart grows spacious. What once seemed unbearable becomes an opportunity for growth. This is how wounds become wisdom. This is how enemies become teachers. And this is how we slowly step into the same path walked by the Buddha, one breath, one pause, one act of compassion at a time. Ancient stories of the Buddha carry timeless lessons, but wisdom does not belong only to the past. Even today, we find people who transform pain into strength, who turn betrayal into gratitude, and who remind us that the human spirit is far more resilient than we imagine. Take, for example, the story of Nelson Mandela. For 27 years, he lived as a prisoner, cut off from freedom, humiliated and mistreated. Many would emerge with bitterness etched into their souls. But Mandela walked out of prison with forgiveness in his heart. He said, "As I walked out the door toward my freedom, I knew that if I did not leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison." Mandela's enemies, those who oppressed him, became his greatest teachers. They taught him the futility of hatred, the power of patience, and the depth of compassion needed to heal a divided nation. His resilience reminds us that freedom is not simply the absence of chains, but the liberation of the heart. Or consider Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived the horrors of the concentration camps during World War II. Surrounded by cruelty, stripped of everything, he discovered a truth that would shape his life. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Instead of drowning in hatred, Frankl chose meaning. He chose to see even his suffering as a lesson. From that lesson, he taught millions that gratitude can exist even in the darkest places, that the mind can remain free even when the body is caged. And then there are quieter stories, lived by people we may never know. A woman betrayed by her closest friend who, after years of anguish, learns to be thankful for the betrayal because it opened her eyes to self-reliance and true companionship. A man who lost his job through deceit, only to later realize that this loss forced him onto the path of his true calling. These are not tales of saints or sages. They are the stories of ordinary people who discovered extraordinary strength when life wounded them. Their pain became a mirror, their enemies became mentors, and gratitude became their freedom. What do all these stories reveal? That resilience is not about avoiding pain, but about transforming it. That gratitude does not come only when life is kind, but especially when it is not. And that those who hurt us, as hard as it may be to admit, often shape us more than those who comfort us. When we hear such stories, they invite us to reflect on our own lives. Who has hurt us? Who has betrayed us? Can we look back and see that, in some way, their actions shaped the person we are today? Can we find a thread of gratitude woven through the fabric of our wounds? Modern stories remind us, the path of resilience and gratitude is not distant, not reserved for the enlightened few. It is alive in our time, alive in people who walk the same streets as we do, and it is alive in us, waiting to be awakened when we choose not to let suffering harden us, but to let it teach us. Hatred is heavy. It clings to us like chains, draining our energy, distorting our vision, poisoning our hearts. For most of us, when someone wounds us, hatred feels like the natural response, sharp, fiery, almost protective. But in truth, hatred never protects. It only deepens the wound. The Buddha compared hatred to holding a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at another. Who burns first? Always the one holding the coal. Hatred consumes us long before it touches anyone else. So how do we shift from hatred to gratitude? The journey begins not with forcing ourselves to be thankful, but with seeing clearly. When someone hurts us, we look within and notice the suffering their actions stir up. That pain becomes our teacher. It shows us our attachments, our fears, our ego's need for control. In this way, those who harm us unknowingly point us towards self-discovery. Then comes the realization. Every wound carries a hidden lesson. Betrayal teaches us discernment. Insult teaches us patience. Rejection teaches us resilience. Each injury, painful as it is, becomes a stepping stone toward wisdom. Gratitude grows when we see that without these challenges, we would never develop the strength to rise above them. Think of the lotus flower, so often used in Buddhism. It blooms pure and radiant, but only because it grew from the mud. Without the darkness, there is no flower. Without hardship, there is no awakening. Gratitude is the recognition of this truth. A monk once shared the story of being humiliated in public. At first, his heart boiled with anger, but as days passed, he reflected, "If I cannot endure insult, how can I claim to walk the path of peace?" Slowly, the humiliation became his greatest teacher. Years later, he bowed in gratitude, not to the praise he received in life, but to the insults that trained his heart. The shift happens quietly, like dawn breaking after a long night. Hatred fades not because the pain was erased, but because the heart sees deeper. Gratitude arises not as denial, but as liberation. The freedom to no longer carry resentment, the freedom to see every wound as a teacher, the freedom to walk lighter in the world. When hatred turns to gratitude, enemies lose their power over us. We stop being prisoners of the past. We step into a new space, one where every hurt has meaning, every loss carries wisdom, and every challenge opens the door to awakening. This is the shift. From burning coals to open hands, from bitterness to blessing, from hatred to gratitude. We have walked together through wounds and mirrors, through karma and compassion, through stories of resilience both ancient and modern. And now, as we arrive at the end, there is a quiet truth that lingers. Sometimes the greatest gratitude is not shouted aloud, but whispered silently in the heart. When someone wounds us, we don't need to bow before them or thank them with words they may never understand. The gratitude is not for them. It is for the lesson their actions awakened within us. The silent thank you is enough. It is the seed we carry inside, the seed that blossoms into patience, compassion, and wisdom. Think of all the people who have crossed your path, the ones who supported you, yes, but also the ones who challenged you, betrayed you, tested you. Without them, you would not be who you are today. Each one was part of your training. Each one was a hidden teacher. The Buddha never asked us to pretend that pain doesn't hurt. He asked us to see beyond it, to recognize that life itself is a teacher, and every person we meet is part of that teaching. Some come as friends, some come as enemies, but all come with a lesson. And when we realize this, something extraordinary happens. Our hearts no longer carry the weight of hatred. We begin to live lighter, freer, more open. Gratitude becomes the air we breathe, not just for the good days, but also for the storms that shaped us. So, in this final moment, let us close our eyes and silently thank those who hurt us. Thank them not for the wound itself, but for the wisdom it revealed. Thank them not because they were right, but because they unknowingly helped us grow. Thank them not with words, but with the way we live, with more patience, more compassion, more love. This is the silent thank you. It requires no audience, no recognition, no return. It is a gift we give to ourselves, and by giving it, we are finally free. And so, the journey ends where it began, with the wound. But now we see it differently, not as a curse, but as a doorway, not as a burden, but as a teacher. And to that teacher, even in silence, we bow with gratitude. If this reflection has touched something within you, let it be a reminder that wisdom is always close, waiting in each breath, in each moment. If you wish to continue walking this path together, I invite you to subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here, we share timeless teachings, stories of resilience, and the gentle art of living with awareness. May these words nourish your journey. May they bring you peace, clarity, and compassion. And if you feel called, share this with someone who may need a little light today. Until we meet again, breathe deeply, walk gently, and carry gratitude in your heart.